Hi guys, I want to deal with the nature of political science. People have said political science is not a science. Others have said it's a science. Some people want to say we should call the discipline political studies, and political science has no locus to be called a science. In fact, if you look at so many scholars, have argued that we cannot call the discipline a science because it deals with human beings, because it deals with sometimes things that are abstract, sometimes it deals with so many things. The discipline has one definition in the discipline would have so many meanings, or one issue in a discipline will have so many meanings. If you talk about democracy, for instance, people give it different meanings and interpretations, and whereas H2O is always equal to water, the terms in political science are sometimes susceptible to different meanings and definitions and all that. If you look at a scholar like Edmund Beck, who is himself a political science, he says something that was quite I would say below the belt in the quest of political scientists to call themselves scientists. He said, there is no science of politics any more than there is a science of aesthetics. For the lines of politics are not like the lines of mathematics. No lines can be laid down for civil and political wisdom. They are a matter incapable of exact definition. This is a political scientist himself saying this, that look, he's making this point to push or project the view that political science cannot be called a science. The view of another scholar called Maitland is even more sarcastic. Listen to what Maitland said. He said, when I see a good set of examination questions headed by the words political science, I regret not the questions but the title. When I see a good set of examination questions headed by the words political science, I regret not the questions but the title. So these scholars clearly refuse to see anything scientific about political science. And so for them, they feel that the discipline is not a science. But there is an objection to this view. And there is an objection to the claim that political science cannot be called a science. And indeed, many scholars have rubbished the claim that political science is not a science. And they have argued that if we want to look at it, if we want to look at it whether political science is science or not, we should first interrogate the method of inquiry of the natural sciences and see whether political science follow these same methods. So in the natural sciences, how do they go about unraveling their mysteries? How do they go about coming out with a finding? What is the methodological approaches and what are the methodological steps that are resorted to in trying to unravel or discover something by the natural scientists? Essentially, what they do, they follow these steps. Number one will be the construction of theories, drawing of hypotheses, observation, data collection, data categorization, data analysis, generalizations, and predictions. The natural sciences, when they want to go about unearthing a finding, this is what they do. They construct theories, they draw hypotheses, they do data collection through whatever means, including observation, data categorization, data analysis. They make generalizations or they draw conclusions, and then they offer predictions. Now, if this is the methodology of the natural sciences, then political science has come of age to be called science. Because in his attempt to also come out with a finding, These are the same steps that the political scientists use. If you look at Aristotle, he was able to study constitutions by merely observing empirically how constitutions operate. And he was able to come out with serious findings about constitution through just observation. And observation in itself is a means of scientific data collection. And so the point is that political science, even though deals with human beings, uses the same method of inquiry adopted by the natural sciences in its quest to unravel or to discover or to come out with a finding. So, to the extent that the methodology of inquiry used by both disciplines is the same, then political science is a science, because in terms of methods, it uses the same approach and the same methods that are deployed by the natural sciences. But even though the discipline is a science, it must be considered and admitted that there are challenges, there are issues. Number one, its chief method of inquiry are human beings. Human beings are oftentimes not predictable. You cannot predict human beings with certainty. Whereas the chief objects of the natural sciences are most at times inanimate objects that are the same everywhere. Human beings are not the same everywhere. They cannot be predicted. When they are satisfied, they have their views. When they are hungry, they have their views. When they are emotional, the way they behave is different from when they are in another mood. So, that presents a problem for the political scientist. Again, the natural scientist always talks about things that can be empirically measured. But the political scientist in his inquiry oftentimes comes across some findings that cannot be subjected to quantitative analysis. Some of the responses people give in our attempt to tease out empirical information from them are responses that cannot be tested empirically. You ask somebody, why did you do this? And he cannot offer explanations to why he behaved the way he behaved. And these things are supposed to be interrogated by the political scientists. Again, there is another problem. The fact that human beings are not like tadpoles. See, political scientists deal with human beings. And human beings are not like tadpoles who can be subjected to laboratory tests and all those things that the natural scientists, subject their sometimes animate and sometimes inanimate objects through. So you cannot just use human beings in your experiment like the way the natural scientist would use his object of study in an experiment. And that also presents a problem for us. And maybe last but not the least, I think I've said it, and let me just emphasize the point that you see for the natural scientist, H2O is always equal to water. Whether you are an Ewe, whether you are a Ga, whether you are a Christian, whether you are a Muslim, whether you are in Ghana, whether you are in Accra, whether you are in London, H2O is always equal to water. So they come out with truths that have universal applicability. Okay? At the same time, H2O means water. But among the political scientists, the findings are oftentimes tainted by, not oftentimes, but sometimes the findings are tainted by the biases and the preferences of the researcher. Your biases and preferences cannot intrude into your findings. H2O is always equal to water, regardless of your biases and findings. But in the social science discipline, sometimes the biases and findings, so biases and preferences of the researchers sometimes intrude into the findings of the researcher. But the political scientist still has so many responses to some of the criticisms that are leveled against the claim that the discipline is a science. For instance, they believe, you see, they object to this claim that one concept has different meanings. They objected to it by saying that, well, if I assigned a meaning to a concept and you use that same meaning in your investigations, you should be able to arrive at a similar findings of mine. And so don't tell me about different meanings or different definitions, but if you use the definition that I have given, then you are likely to arrive at the same conclusion that I draw. The other bit about our values and biases intruding into our findings, the political scientist said that that's why we have peer review of our work. If you go undertake a research and you write your findings, it must be subjected to peer review so that people, your colleagues, will review to be sure that your own biases have not, infiltrated or intruded into your findings. So they have other responses in their defense, just to make the point that, look, political science has come of age to be called a science. If it is just by way of, a discipline is called science because of the methodology it adopts in its inquiry, then to the extent that political scientists use the same methodology that the natural scientists use, it will be unfair to refer to natural scientists as science and then political scientists as not science, because in terms of methodology we use the same methods, and we use the same scientific approach to unraveling mysteries and to discovering our findings. Thank you.